Jesus loved to speak in riddles. Nowhere in the Bible is this more evident than in what we're going to look at this morning, one of Jesus' riddles. It's called a beatitude. That's a fancy word that means a statement that offers a blessing. But when you actually look at it, it's more of a word puzzle to me than it is an automatic, oh yeah, I get that kind of blessing. Yeah, I'll read it for you from the Good News Translation. Matthew chapter 5, verse 4. Jesus said, "Happy are those who mourn. God will comfort them." Now, how can it be that somebody, even Jesus, would take the word happy and the word mourn and put them in the same sentence? The word mourn refers specifically to grieving for a lost loved one. It refers not just to a feeling of sadness, but to that whole process by which in their day they would grieve, in our day we would grieve. Going through a funeral, going through all of the aftermath, telling the story 100 times to loved ones and breaking down every single time and having the house be empty or that seat at the end of the table be empty. And mourning was and is a very real fact in our broken world. Now, the word happy that Jesus uses isn't just sort of, ha, I just heard a good story, happy. It talks about the deepest possible joy and happiness that a human being is capable of. Something that brings the sense of fulfillment that, yeah, this is what life is all about. This is what God really meant for it to be like. How do you put those two in the same sentence? Deep-rooted joy and happiness for a person who's mourning, because God will comfort them. It's a riddle. It is not self-evident that this works, that these two words ever belong in the same sentence. Our experience says absolutely not. Our experiences say unhappy are those who mourn, because that's where we're at. So if we're going to understand this riddle, we need to unpack it. We need to puzzle over it. We need to walk it out in our own life and just see whether this is really true. You see, the reason we mourn is that we live in a broken world. It's a good world, but it's a world that falls short in terms of what we know it could be. When God created this world, He gave it His stamp of approval. He said, it's good. Every part of it is good. And then He looked at people and said, very good. We can look at the news every morning on our iPad or on our phone, or we can watch the news at night, and we can see plenty of evidence that humans aren't very good all the time. And we can look at our world and see the brokenness of that world in a million ways. We especially feel that brokenness when we experience loss. It might be a child losing a pet. It might be the breakup of a marriage. It might be a devastating diagnosis that comes out of the blue, or the loss of a loved one. We experience this brokenness in the wider world, again, through nowadays 24/7 media, fires raging in California, taking the lives of people who are simply trying to drive out of harm's way. Tsunamis and earthquakes and volcanoes and the endless story of wars here, there, and everywhere. The violence here at home that just doesn't seem to go away. We live in a world that has been degraded. Paul described this world as being in the bondage of decay. It was meant to be better, but boy, it just has a way of having things go downhill. And in response to that, we grieve because we know it shouldn't be like that. We know that isn't the way God meant the world to be. Now, I want you to do something for me this morning. This will be a way for you to engage with whatever God is doing in your life right now. There's a piece of paper in the little holder in the front of the pew before you. And you may have to dig around for it. It's just a little piece that slides in there, a piece of white paper. And I would encourage every person here to take one of those out. And what I'm going to ask you to do at the beginning of our talk here this morning is to think about a major loss that you have experienced that's still very real to you, or that you are experiencing. You may be in the middle of it. Or it may be something that you sort of see on the horizon and you're hoping it won't happen, but somehow you know that this is something that just may come into your life in a very, very, very terrible way. I want you to think about that. I'm not thinking just of trivial things like I can't find my keys, but I'm thinking more of a deep loss that can just maybe has already thrown you off track. You don't know exactly how to handle it. Now, there'll be a few of us here who might say, right now that's not happening and I just can't think of one. And I would say for you, think of a loss that someone you care about is experiencing. Because you can go through this time on behalf of that other person and really see what God is doing. So take a moment and write down what that might be. Might be just one word. I know mine last night was just one word, one family member that I know won't be with us forever. And that's a lost story that's still in the early stages. Whatever it might be, there are no right or wrong answers here, but take a moment to write that down. And hang on to this paper because at the end of the service, I'm going to give you an opportunity to come to these two crosses and to invite Jesus to become part of the grief journey that is connected to what you're writing on this piece of paper. Grief, we understand now, is not something that happens all at once, and it's not something that happens the same way for everybody. It happens in stages. And if you're familiar with Kubler-Ross or David Kessler, her partner, if we can look at the next slide, they designated 5 stages of grief that are typical to our human experience. It begins with denial, which is really not a negative thing. It's not a bad thing. It's not a sign of not really understanding what's going on. It's the way we begin to cope with a loss. And we begin by saying, well, it's really not that bad. It's not that bad. Oh, I think it'll turn out all right. Or I think I'll be able to handle this. But then as the loss becomes more real and as the pain becomes more irresistible, we cannot hold it down anymore, and the consequences are beginning to crowd into our lives, we typically move on to the second phase of anger. And at that point, we may be asking questions, whose fault is this anyway? Who did something that caused me to feel this bad right now? And again, that's a typical response to feel anger at a world that doesn't work the way it was meant to. To feel anger at something happening in our lives that's causing us and causing our loved ones to hurt so badly. And we may just feel like lashing out. We may become terse with other people. We may begin finding ourselves assigning blame. I've had a little motto for myself as a pastor walking with families through a funeral. And what I tell myself is just remember, no one's responsible for anything they say during those first 3, 4, 5 days after the loss of a loved one. Because they're in that early stage of shock and denial, or maybe just feeling angry about these feelings that are just bubbling up. Whose fault is it anyway? Now, if the loss hasn't happened yet, it's just sort of a possibility, maybe a very dire possibility. Chances are we will do a little bargaining. We may bargain with the universe. We may bargain with God himself. And we may just say, if I do this, will you do that? If I'm really good, if I start going to church, if I start getting my act together, then maybe, you'll kind of notice that and sort of make this bad thing not ever happen. If something terrible has happened, if a loved one has passed or things have gone wrong, the other side of the bargaining stage is to say, well, if only. If only I'd called the doctor sooner. If only I'd left the house 5 minutes later. Right? If only. We're trying to find a mental way to escape this pain that is coming in more and more as we're going into this grieving process. The 4th stage is the deepest one in the process. They refer to that as depression. That's where we say, what's the point of going on? We have no fight left in us. We found out that the if-onlys don't fix the problem. We found out that just being angry doesn't make the pain go away. We found out that denial is long since a failed strategy. And now we're just sitting in that ocean of grief. But there is a 5th stage, the stage of acceptance, where we begin to say, I think I'm ready for a new journey. Doesn't mean that we stop caring about the loved one who passed or about the problem that we had been going through or that a friend is going through. It just means that we've come to that point where We've made peace with that situation as best we can, and we're ready to move on with our lives. Now, you may be at any one of those stages, or the person that you're thinking of may be at any one of those stages. So do me a favor and take the paper out again. And I know you haven't thought about this a long time, but maybe a first impression as you look at those 5 words: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Write the word that seems to fit, or if it's a couple of them, maybe with a question mark after it. But just write down your impression of where you might be in this particular situation of loss that you're putting on your paper today. And again, if this isn't happening for you, then there may be a loved one or a friend, and you're just thinking of where they are at. And just put that down, so that you can sort of anchor yourself in with a little bit of your story that God can then connect with his story. Now, the same Jesus who spoke this riddle of happiness and mourning coming together promises to guide us every step of the grieving journey. So what's that look like? Well, the gospel writer John paints a very vivid picture of what it means for Jesus to walk with us in every step of a grief journey. He tells the story of Jesus and 3 of his very best friends, a woman named Martha, her sister Mary, and their brother Lazarus. And we know from other parts of the Gospels that Jesus had dinner with these folks. They were his Airbnb when he was going to Jerusalem. I'm sure he didn't have to pay, but he knew he could stop there, and he could bring a crowd with him, and they would entertain them and would be a safe haven for them just a few miles outside of the city of Jerusalem. Well, the story that we look at today begins with Lazarus falling sick. Now, we have no indication that Lazarus was perennially ill. We have no indication that he was an older person. Probably was a young man, pretty much like Jesus and his other followers. And I would imagine that when he first became sick, his 2 sisters, Martha and Mary, didn't think a whole lot of it. They probably thought he had a cold or the flu or a stomach bug or whatever the kinds of things went around in those days. But then as Lazarus' condition worsened and he became, bedridden and wasn't turning the corner, they sent for Jesus. Now, you can just sort of maybe put your mind into where they must have been at. Oh, he's not getting better. Yeah, we've tried A, B, and C. We called the doctor. Something's wrong. We really need to get some help here. Let's call Jesus. And what does that mean? Everything will be all right. Jesus will fix it. And that was not an irrational way of thinking, because Jesus had healed so many people. Well, if he could heal total strangers, if he could heal blind people and raise a little girl from death and do all of these incredible things for total strangers, just think how powerful he would be and how ready he would be to come to pour out healing for his very best friends. So maybe we just have a little bit of the denial that this won't be that bad. Jesus will fix it here at the beginning of this story. But Jesus doesn't come. He's at least a full day's journey away. It takes a day to go find him, and then it would have been a day to come back. But he doesn't come immediately back. When Jesus arrives, the funeral has already begun. The body was buried already 4 days before, and they are deep in the midst of the grieving process. What do you think Martha was feeling when she met Jesus outside the house that day? Listen to her words in John 11:21. Lord, first words, like not even hello, okay? Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Do you think those were said with a real sweet smile? Or do you think there was some hurt? Dare we say some anger, frustration, pain coming forth from this person who basically was probably thinking, I thought you cared more than this. I thought we told you how bad it was. There wasn't any time for whatever you had to do. You needed to be here. We were waiting for you. We hoped and thought and prayed that you would be here. And we watched him slip away, and we watched his last breath come, and Right to that moment, and even for a half an hour or even a half a day later, we were still hoping you would come in and change this whole situation. But you didn't come. And so we had to bury him. And now it's too late. Anger. The far side of bargaining. Ever been there with God? I won't ask for hands. But have you ever been there with God? When there was something that you just prayed for, not even for yourself, but maybe for someone in your family or one of your friends. And you knew what the book says about Jesus healing, and if we anoint with oil, the sick will be healed, and on and on and on. And you prayed, and hey, you did all the right things, and you got it on 17 prayer chains, and you came to church, and you went forward 20 times, and you did all the right things, and Jesus didn't seem to come. And that's where Martha and Jesus are at that moment. Now, it's very important to recognize what Jesus does in response. He does not argue with her. He does not reprimand her. He doesn't give her a little sermon about how she's supposed to show a little respect to the Son of God. Thank you very much. He doesn't say to her, well, God has a bigger plan. He doesn't give her pat answers. He joins her right where she is, in the midst of that hurt, of not understanding why this journey went in this way. The one thing he does, however, is he does not go down the trail of all of the if-onlys. Doesn't get lost in all of those back alleys that never come out to any good conclusion anyway. Instead, he gives her just a little glimpse of God's greater story. It's not a lecture. It's not a correction. But he's encouraging her to take one step. Not run a mile. Not get over it, girl. But take one step. And it goes this way in verse 25. He says, Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. There's something bigger than what you're feeling here. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. And then he says this, do you believe this? Now think about what he's saying. In the middle of the hurt, while you're feeling angry, while the if-onlys are roaring through your head, while you're feeling that pain just grow deeper and deeper, Jesus is saying to her, I know where you are. I know it doesn't make sense. I know it's all upside down. I know you can't even see past your nose right now on this thing. But down deep inside, can you dare to believe that somehow God has something bigger in this story? Do you dare to believe that? Do you dare to believe that God could be present with you with all of his life and power right where you are right now? Moments later, he encounters Mary. Now, these are two sisters, and they're as different as night and day in some ways. Martha is the activist. She's the take-charge person. She's the one who makes the decisions. She's the one that gets the work done. Which means that Mary had the privilege of not being the one to always have to get the work done. She was more the feeler. She's more the one who wanted to kind of be more contemplative and basically sit like a student at Jesus' feet while Martha was in the kitchen. You can kind of picture that one. That didn't always go well for them as sisters. Well, now Mary is still back at the house, and she gets word that Jesus is here. So now that Martha's talked to Jesus, Mary comes, and through her tears, she says, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. But she has no fight left in her. There's not going to be any discussion of theology with Mary. She's long since even given up on being angry about this. She is just in that deep well of grief. Jesus tells us that just as Jesus had joined Martha in her questioning, he now joins Mary in her deep sorrow. Verses 33 to 35 paint the picture for us. When Jesus saw her weeping And the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. This term, deeply moved, is just an attempt to translate the word that John used, which meant to be absolutely torn up, even angry, just overwhelmed with emotion, to the point where you're just shaking. There aren't words for how you feel. There aren't words to describe what that is like. But it's just complete emotional overload, if you will. And Jesus is standing there watching his best friend crying her heart out. And he's just completely overtaken by that grief. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. He's joining her. Where is his body now? That one little remaining part of him that you can go and be near as you remember the person that you lost. Let's go to the cemetery. Let's go to the place where he is. You see, Jesus again is just saying, let me walk with you right here. "Oh, come and see," the crowd said. And then we read, Jesus wept. There is the great Son of God, bawling like a baby, stumbling along a path from a house to a tomb, alongside his best friend. Because that's where she was. And he wouldn't choose to be anywhere else. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression. Martha and Mary experience all of these stages of grief. They're compacted for us, aren't they, in this little story? As you probably well know, these stages play out over months in our lives, years in our lives, when we suffer a significant loss. But John puts them all there for us to see in microcosm. And there's Jesus, right there with his friends, at each stage, and in some amazing way in each stage. So how would this journey end? Well, Martha and Mary brought Jesus to the tomb of Lazarus. Now, the cemetery of that day was not like in our day where we come up and find, a grassy plot and a headstone. In those days, they would bury the loved one in a cave or in a chamber that was cut out of rock, if they could afford that kind of burial, which this family could do. And then there was a small opening. Typically, it was very, very low. And they would roll a huge stone over it so that no one would tamper with the body of the loved one. And so this is what Jesus and Martha and Mary and their fellow mourners came to. It's here we begin to get a glimpse of the reality that Jesus spoke of in this riddle that we are talking about this morning. How do you put happy and mourn together? You see, when Jesus arrived at the grave, he gave an utterly incomprehensible order. He said, "Take away the stone." Take away the stone? Martha now is already reconciled to the fact that her brother is gone. He's been dead for 4 days. She protests in very graphic terms. She said, "No, we move that stone. This will not be good." His body has already begun to decay. It was too late for such actions. I know she's probably thinking, if you wanted to raise a dead person, 3 days ago would have been a great time to show up. She didn't say it, but it probably was going through the back of her mind. But at this point, it's like, it's a little bit too late for this kind of stuff, Lord. And Jesus replies in verse 40, reminding Martha of their conversation of perhaps a half an hour or an hour before. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So you see, moving that stone for Martha meant opening up to the radical possibility that God was going to do something wonderful to repair his broken world. That God was going to specifically intervene in this all too familiar story of love and sickness and death and loss, and do something radically different. Well, they rolled the stone back. And Jesus called to Lazarus in verse 43, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Now, what made this funeral unlike any other wasn't just that a miracle happened. What made this funeral different was that there was one guest at the funeral who could change everything. Jesus, the Lord of creation, was present to give us a glimpse of what God's restored world will one day look like. It was as if the end of the story was somehow subjected to a cut and paste and dropped right into the middle of Martha and Mary's and Lazarus's earthly life story. Happy are those who mourn, and God will comfort them. Those words are not just some sort of timeless proverb that we're supposed to memorize and is supposed to make us feel better when we're hurting. No, those were spoken by someone who could make that happen, by the only being that could make that happen, the only person that can change the broken narratives of this world, the broken narrative of that marriage that didn't work out and still haunts us for years thereafter. The broken narrative of walking into a doctor's office and learning that you have something the doctor doesn't know how to fix. And then you walk away just wondering what the world is all about. The broken narrative of losing a loved one. The broken narrative of a world that just goes crazy with violence for seemingly no reason whatsoever. What makes the difference, the only thing that makes a difference, is that Jesus shows up. And when he does, he can do what this world can never do. Back in the book of Isaiah, God speaks through Isaiah words that Jesus applied to himself in an effort to help people understand what it means for the Lord of creation to be present in his broken world to make things right. And these are the words that Jesus quoted. I'll read to you from Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 through 3. "The Spirit of the sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor." To be anointed meant to be Messiah. "He has sent me to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair." What you have there on the one side of the ledger is a description of how people grieved in Isaiah's day. What you did not do when you were grieving was oil your hair and prepare yourself to look presentable to the world. Instead, you put ashes on yourself, on your hair, on your skin. You had that appearance of just being utterly consumed by the grief that you were feeling. You didn't put on your regular clothes. You tore your clothes, actually. And then you put on sackcloth and sat. You think of Job in the very powerful descriptions of him after he's lost his family. And that is the picture of us in our wandering through those 5 stages of grief. That's where we are. But Jesus said, "I came to do something different." Even in the midst of whatever your story is, Jesus has come to join you in it, but also to walk you out toward the way only God can end the story. Where a crown of beauty is placed on your head instead of ashes. Where there's the oil of joy instead of mourning. And a garment of praise, brand new clothes, instead of a spirit of despair, those old grave clothes that wrap us up. When I was in the 7th grade, I had a brand new experience, a number of brand new experiences. I went to a new school and found out that I was signed up for shop class. My dad did not have a shop or anything downstairs, so this was my first time to ever take a piece of wood in my hand and make something out of it. And it was a big adventure for me. You know, this was all hand tools. I mean, we were learning how to use a plane, and you'd hold it and you'd angle the blade just right and get it just deep enough and work on that piece of poplar, and then sanding and all the things, putting the drill press and putting holes in this wood. And I worked and worked on this project. It was just going to be a little fruit stand, it was 2 boards, dowels going across, and then a couple little legs, and then you put apples in it or bananas or something, and Mom was going to keep it forever. That was one of those projects, I had that thing just about finished, and I worked hard. Somebody stole it. Gone. Now, when you're in 7th grade, you're on the verge of crisis and existential despair most of the time. And that put me right over. I was just over the edge. I was just devastated. I can still, in my mind, see that 7th grader, the 12-year-old kid, coming home from school. It would have broken your heart, just walking along. 6, 8 blocks. The world was over. I was devastated. I was angry that someone stole. No, people hadn't stolen from me before. It's like, whoa. And I had put so much into that project. It was like I was going to get this thing right. And gone. And, I went to the teacher, and teacher said, well, you'll just have to make another one. And I'm like, what? I'm now 3 weeks behind. Everybody else is done, and I'm going to start from scratch here? Devastated. Went up that night to my bedroom. My brother and I had a room on the 3rd floor of the parsonage. And an amazing thing happened. I had a little New Testament, my grandfather's New Testament. And I must have done Bible Lotto. I don't know how I got to Romans 8. I must have just help. This is the verse I came to. Because I was not a student of Romans or Paul or anything like that. God put me in this verse. It's in Romans 8:18. And I'll read you right from the King James Version that I was reading back in 1963 or whatever it was. For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us. Let me tell you, a little kid read those words and a million light bulbs went off in my head. Boom! I could see my hurt. I could see my suffering. My grieving as a child. I could see that. And then I could see Jesus, in a sense, just saying, look, I know it hurts there. I know it's overwhelming. I know you don't know how you're going to fix that. I know you're angry that someone took your project. But he wasn't saying, it's no big deal. He was just saying, watch what will happen. This will just become part of a bigger story that's so much better. And I remember that verse just clicked in my head, and it never, ever went away. It's kind of crazy, isn't it? 50 years go by, and you're still still can live that moment. Now, that didn't mean I had a new project. I had to go back, start from scratch, planing the wood, drilling the hole, did the whole thing. I did build a little thing. I think I got one other project stolen that year. It was sort of oh yeah, at that point it was oh yeah, that's what they do, and I'll make another one. But God was showing me, it's okay to be where you are, but it's not the end of the story. Jesus is here to comfort you right now. Whatever loss you wrote down on that paper, whatever loss you are fearing, kind of almost maybe knowing it's coming, whatever loss you see afflicting a loved one, the flowers you see here this morning are not just decoration. The Bulleris family will be having a funeral here in this space just an hour and a half or so for a brother who passed away. So whatever loss you're feeling, Jesus is saying, I'm there with you. I was there for Martha and Mary. You're just as important to me as Martha and Mary. He's here to guide us no matter what stage we might be in, or if we don't even know what stage we're in. He's not going to rush the process. Go back to that story with Martha and Mary. He never hurried them along. He never even said, oh, I know how you feel. He just felt it with them. He walked at their pace. And he helped them take just one step. Maybe it was just a question of, can you believe something in this dark place? Maybe it was the question, can you take me to the gravesite? Or maybe it was the big question, would you dare to let me in? Roll away the stone. He wants to do that for you. He's the one who heals the brokenhearted. He's the one that Paul calls the God of all comfort. So I'm going to ask the band to come up at this time. And this is what I'm going to ask you to do. And if you haven't written anything on the paper yet, you still have time. Something may have bubbled up in your mind. And even now, take it out and write down on it whatever that loss might be. And if you want to, write down some words that go with it. Maybe the stage or the feelings that are with you right now. And when we stand and the band begins to play, I'm going to encourage you to come and invite Jesus to take the journey with you. And the way we do that is to pin this to the cross. And just say, Lord, thank you that you're the one who turns mourning into joy in a way that brings all the healing that's necessary. Wherever I'm at, I welcome you in. And we'll finish this journey together. Our Father, I pray that you would just make this a time of us knowing that you are walking with us up to this cross where we pin this paper. I pray, Lord, that we would know that you're walking with us back to our seats and out to our cars and onward in the journey that you have for us. We pray, Holy Spirit, that you would just reveal the God of all comfort. In Jesus' name, amen. Let's stand together. And as the band leads us, come on down and just leave this thing with Jesus.